Hey guys, Bowserkins here for another video. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're actually going to be talking about the Mythic Plus meta for Shadowlands Season 2. It's not normally the type of video that I would make, but there were some really cool outliers this season. Some really cool points to be made. I feel like it was worth making a spotlight, so we're going to go ahead and talk about that today. First, I want to start out because it's the tank channel for the most part. A lot of the content you're going to find here is based around um, tanks and specifically the four tank specs that I play. Um, but what's really cool to point out as we get started is how diverse Shadowlands has been for the tank meta specifically. Um, Something like this was not possible in BFA, certainly not in Legion. Legion was dominated by Blood DK. BFA was dominated for the most part by Prot Warrior, especially towards the end there, right? I think season one of BFA was a little bit more diverse, um, even though there were a couple of specs even in BFA that were awful. Think about Blood DK, for example, after the Bone Storm nerf. Um, Never really recovered from that. Vengeance Demon Hunter. Um, but as we move through this video, you'll get an understanding of where the public opinion is and then where the actual facts lie within a spec. I do want to highlight that because there are a lot of people who constantly make really dumb takes about, oh well, my spec is really weak. I'm not succeeding in Mythic Plus or whatever because uh, my spec is broken. Blah blah blah. Um, those types of things are usually exaggerated. So let's just go ahead and take a look at the top ranks here. What you've seen on your screen so far. Obviously, the very tippy top is getting dominated by Andy Brew on his Holy Paladin. Andy Brew, I believe, was a Brewmaster main last season until he rolled Prot Paladin this season. Of course, he's got an exceptional mastery, I believe, of all tank specs. And this year, going with Prot Paladin is working out pretty well for him. Prot Paladin's been a pretty popular spec in season two specifically. Season one, I think the most popular spec was Guardian Druid, and we'll get into all that stuff here in a little bit in terms of uh, where the actual percentages break down and what's the most popular. But all the specs are represented in the top 20 here. You've got um, Andy Brew on his Holy Paladin. Number two right here is a Brewmaster, perfectly fine. Guardian Druids throughout, Vengeance Demon Hunters. And then you've got the Blood DK here. I think in the top 20, actually, when I first looked at this, there was a Prot Warrior in here. It looks like someone has slid out of the top 20. Yeah, so here's red, just below 3K rating at number 31 for Prot Warrior. And that kind of is reflected um, in the breakdown of who's actually playing what spec in uh, in Shadowlands Season 2. Prot Warrior is probably the weakest tank for Mythic Plus right now. But again, you are you can absolutely crush on Prot Warrior. So let's go ahead and get into that part. So this is aggregate data from Raider.io. You can do a whole lot of different things with this. You can look at team leaderboards, class roles, spec leaderboards. You can look at time burning leaderboards, which is what I'm doing here. And we're just going to keep it lax. It's just going to be a Mythic Plus level 10 and up. This will get a good representation of who's actually playing Mythic Plus. I'm not going to look at anything lower than plus 10 because you're not even playing the full gambit of affixes from week to week. Um, in my opinion, Mythic Plus doesn't even start until you hit level 10. So that's what we're going to be looking at. And this is class frequency by run, not unique. So if people are running more keys as their Guardian Druid, it'll show up in this data rather than looking at individual accounts running their own. And as you can see from the breakdown here, Guardian Druid is still pretty far up there. However, Prot Paladin is still number one. I don't know if this was the case in season one. I know that it was, Guardian Druid had a lot of the high IOs in season one, and that's certainly the case in season two as well. But um, Prop Paladin is still pretty popular. I mean, it's obviously 1 and 2 right here. It's Prop Paladin as Guardian Druid. Vengeance Vengeance Demon Hunter at number 3 doesn't surprise me. And then you've got Blood Decay at 10%, 9% for Brewmaster, and then Prot Warrior down at the bottom. I think the reason that Prot Warrior is actually lower than it is because the Reprisal Lego is probably the most interactive of any of the meta Legos that any of the specs play. I mean, the Prop Paladin Legendary is hilariously straightforward and pretty darn strong. Everybody plays the Ursoc Sphere to remember Legendary for Guardian Druid, so again, very straightforward, very easy to understand. I don't think there's a lot of deviation with Vengeance. I don't play Vengeance Demon Hunter, but from what I understand, there were 2 options in season 1, and most people are playing one option now in season 2. Most people are playing the Cake Smash Lego for Brewmaster. Although I do think some people are playing the Charred Passions one for the extra damage, but in the high keys, I don't know if that's actually the case. And then for Blood Decay, it would surprise me if not. If anyone is not playing Crimson Moon Weapon at this point, getting that Dancing Weapon cooldown reduction is pretty massive. Prot Warrior playing Reprisal again, definitely the most complex and skill capped legendary of the tank specs. But I mean, the breakdown is a little bit more skewed towards Prop Paladin and Guardian Druid. But the point that I want to make here, considering this is more than 50% of the tank representation is in Shadowlands Season 2. And this is post 9.1.5, by the way. I didn't want to include data that wasn't current. Um, but all of these tank specs are good. That's the point. I mean, Prop Paladin and Guardian Druid are probably a little bit easier. And Prop Paladin does a huge amount of damage. So, take that with a grain of salt. A lot of people play Prop Paladin at 10 and up because they love doing damage. If we push this up to like 20 and up, let's see what this looks like. It's roughly the same, right? You start to see Prop Paladin fall off even more. Um, yeah, I mean it's relatively the same. People understand that, like, Prop Paladin's going to give you a lot of damage. Guardian Druid's going to give you a lot of damage. Guardian Druid, I think, is pretty darn tanky too, though. What's really interesting is, like, Blood Decay is probably the tankiest tank in Shadowlands right now. I mean, you see people like soloing +20s, like plus 20 keys just with the Blood Decay. I mean, it's completely insane how tanky Blood Decay is. The problem with Blood Decay is that their damage is pretty awful, especially in single target. Blood Decay damage is pretty dreadful. But even in AoE, that might get changed depending on what they actually do with the tier set in season 3. Right now, it's completely broken on the PTR. We're going to see what that actually turns out to be. Um, but if it's giving you like endless dancing weapon, Blood Decay is probably going to skyrocket. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about healers. Right, we've established that all tanks are viable right now. You can be good with any one of these specs. Just be wary of Prot Warrior, because when you start getting into those really high keys, you're like, you have really good physical damage mitigation, but I think, from my own experience in Prot Warrior, if you don't have a spell reflect for a Wicked Bolt, you're just gonna die. And that's just one small example of a greater issue for Prot Warrior and their ability to handle magic damage. So let's go ahead and move over to the healer meta. This one, for as interesting as tank is, I think the healer meta is not interesting at all. Because in the degenerate playstyle and kind of the facts that we've sussed out over the course of now in the 3rd expansion of Mythic Plus, healer damage generally is going to dictate the meta more often than actual, your actual healing throughput, which is extremely unfortunate. I mean, it's so degenerate at this point that Holy Paladins are like relying on teammates to be able to heal the party as opposed to themselves in some situations, which is pretty darn awful at the high key level. But again, this Mythic Plus. Let's look at 10 and up here for this data, And as you can see, I mean, there's not a huge difference between 10 and up and 15 and up. It's pretty straightforward, right? Resto Shaman is a um, third of the representation. You've got Holy Paladin here. I would have to wager though that the majority of these Holy Paladins are playing Kyrian. Venthyr Paladin is not super popular in Mythic Plus until you get to the really high keys, um, where that the extra damage you get is Venthyr, especially in burst scenarios, is necessary. I still see a ton of Kyrian Holy Paladins. But you can see at the bottom here, excuse me, Discipline Priest, and that's really just because of the difficulty of the spec, and then you've got Mistweaver Monks here at the bottom. But you can easily combine the two totals of Priest, right? Because these people are playing the same class. You can just say, okay, well, Priests still account for 18%. But breaking it down into spec, because I don't want to disrespect people who are like disc only Chads, right? Disc Priest is the least represented spec in the healing meta. What's funny about that is, Disc Priest is actually really good. In terms of healer damage, I believe they're pretty firmly in third place right now for healer damage. Which is nothing to shake a stick at. I mean, they're beating out Resto Druids who are playing the Kyrian Legendary Feral build, which is really strong. I mean, I've seen some really good Restoration Druids. But Holy Priest and Mistweaver Monk, I feel, are pretty darn garbage in Mythic Plus right now. And again, this is only just compared. We're talking about the meta, right? If you're running like plus 18s and you want to play Mistweaver Monk, you're not going to have an issue. Period. Okay, you don't need to, unless there's some kind of like glaring deficiency in your group, or if you're pugging, it's even less of an issue. Um, unless you're factoring in discussions like this very one that I'm having right now, where people are having this ridiculous bias against Mistweaver Monk when they're trying to pug their plus 17 Necrotic Wake, right? Where trying to suss out the healer damage is completely irrelevant in that situation. But lots of weird outliers. One thing that's hilarious about Mistweaver Monk is they're generally they've generally been considered the worst healer in Mythic Plus for this season, right down there with Holy Priest. But if you look at the Sanctum of Domination 99th percentile performance, I mean, you don't even have to do 99th percentile. You can do like 80th percentile, right? So like the top 20%. Mistweaver Monk is absolutely dominating in raid healing right now. I cannot convey to you guys how ridiculous this gap is. I mean, they are absolutely dominating. And actually, damage within raid for Mistweaver Monk is not that bad either, right? Pretty much all of them are playing the Fallen Order, but even with ancient teachings of the monastery, you can still do decent damage in raid along with the healing, right? So Mistweaver Monk in raid is absolutely going off, absolutely going off. But if you look at the healing data for the 99th percentile, if you look at the healer data for damage, total parses over the course of Mythic Plus dungeons, Mistweaver Monks morph into this this bottom feeder spec. Absolutely tragic, right? So a huge disparity, and this is kind of what I wish Blizzard would avoid, where one spec is absolutely clapping a raid and then getting clapped in Mythic Plus. This is not the best look for that. So, um, again, hopefully this is something that that Blizzard avoids in the future. Fixing this in Shadowlands Season 3 would definitely be preferable. Because Mistweaver Monk healing is, from what I can tell, really fun, and it provides some pretty unique strengths. But in the really high keys, Mistweaver is like a non-starter for a lot of people, just because it doesn't do as much damage as Resto Shaman, Venthyr Holy Paladin, Kyrian Disc Priests. Um, yeah. Also, I mean, I don't think I highlighted this enough. If you're playing Resto Druid, you have to give the Kyrian Legendary like that whole build with the Feral. If you want to play Resto Druid, Give that build a shot, guys. I guarantee you, it's gonna blow your mind if you practice at it and get good at it. The damage that you can put out with that build is actually pretty nuts. All right, so let's go ahead and look at DPS. I'm going to break this down into melee and range DPS. I believe that is important, especially in Shadowlands, because we had like a long period there where melee DPS. I mean, in Legion, melee DPS dominated, right? It was basically a melee meta for a large portion of Legion. Again, with the disclaimer, you could play range DPS in Legion. Okay, um, exaggerations, hyperbole will destroy the world, right? Look at these discussions honestly. I'm looking at Mythic plus 10 and up, right? If you're running a plus 18 and you're denying people with high IO just because they're a shadow priest, you're an idiot, right? But you know the meta is what it is. So for melee DPS, from what I can understand, and this is post 9.1.5, and the runs that I've done, um, the breakdown isn't necessarily going to reflect the meta, and in fact, in most cases it doesn't, especially when you're looking at plus 10 and up, right? But just based off of popularity, you've got Windwalker monks and Havoc DHs at the top. Huge share of warriors, right? Um, Huge share of warriors. 1/4 of all melee DPS parses in Mythic, or excuse me, all keys logged in Mythic plus 10 and up. 1/4 of the melee DPS are warriors, either Fury and Arms, or either Fury or Arms. Sorry, um, that's a huge share for two specs in a class, right? You look at Rogue, not anywhere near 1/4, right? Um, Huge share for Warrior, and that's pretty well deserved. I mean, Fair Warrior and Armies Warrior both are really strong in Mythic Plus. We saw some of them in the MDI with this past iteration of it. I don't think we saw any in the Great Push, but that's a different format. You're basically going to see only the meta for really high key pushing in something like the Great Push. But in the MDI, I know for sure we saw some warriors, um, arms warriors specifically because of their burst potential, running the Kyrian Legendary. But there are some really good performers. Windwalker Monk is obviously broken. Havoc Demon Hunter can be really strong. Sub Rogue has like a niche um, that it fills. Rogue is very strong in general. Mythic Plus, it continues to be very strong. They're the only one with a party wide invis, so you can get your skips out without burning pots. You've got the numbing poison, which is not, you can't duplicate that with any other spec, right? Or excuse me, any other class. So Rogue is still extremely valuable in a group that utilizes them properly, but Warrior just does massive damage. A couple of things that are underrated with Warrior, though. Piercing Howl is extremely important for kiting. It's not unique. You can get slows from other classes, but Piercing Howl, with the duration of it and the fact that it's 50%, um, is actually a very healthy, especially since you can run a Finesse Conduit to reduce the cooldown of Piercing Howl. Um, if you're looking to get away with kiting, Warrior is pretty decent for a melee DPS representation if you're looking for easy kiting, and you don't have access to something like a Windwalker Monk or a Sub Rogue with crippling poison. Right? Warrior can fill that niche in certain situations, and both specs are doing incredible damage. But there are some outliers, right? So survival is somewhat of a meme, right? Um, the thing about memes, sometimes they're not true at all. As you can see, some of the people who are playing Survival Rogue are complete chads. I mean, here's like 7 people right here who are potentially 8 who are definitely going to get the Tormented Hero title for being in the top 0.1%. So if you're again trying to plug into a plus 19 and people are denying you because you're a survival hunter or kicking you out of group after they invite you, um, they're in the wrong. I mean, your spec is certainly more than adequate to perform in Mythic Plus keys up to a certain level. I mean, these people are doing 26s. This guy here, just this guy alone is doing plus 27, right? So, um, two things about Survival Hunter: you're still getting a fair amount of the utility attributed to hunters. So, um, the two key ones are Binding Shot obviously is, in terms of uh, you know, a kiting tool, is the absolute best, right? It's like an 8-second snare that can't be broken, and then in itself is broken. When they announced the nerf, a lot of people were heartbroken over it. Um, I looked at that Binding Shot nerf before it was reverted and said that's actually got to happen because the strength of Binding Shot is it's insane. Um, but they reverted it, kept it in, and hunters were the beneficiary of that, right? So if you are playing a survival hunter, and you're saying to yourself, "Oh, I can't get into the 20 keys because I'm playing the spec and I need to re-roll something else," trust me, it's not your fault, dude. And it's not just like looking at these guys and saying, "Well, of course these guys, they're really good. Of course they're doing the keys." Survival Hunter is, for people who play it and play it well, you'll understand Survival Hunter is actually really, really freaking good. It's just a combination of people don't actually play it. This is an incredibly underplayed spec, and two, it's really difficult. Survival Hunter is compared to other specs especially if you compare it to something like Fury Warrior, it's actually really difficult. So, Survival Hunter being underrepresented when compared to its actual damage profile and its ability to perform in Mythic Plus. Survival Hunter is really strong right now, but underplayed. And that's kind of also the case for a couple other specs, but one that it isn't, Feral Druid, um, is one of those specs that is not necessarily strong and also very underplayed. And you may have noticed Cybear Slide here, who's absolutely hilarious, by the way. He's actually live as I'm doing this video recording. This guy's an absolute Chad, right? Because he is top 3 on Feral Druid, and he's the number 9th ranked Survival Hunter, right? This guy is playing Survival Hunter and Feral Druid. Absolute hero. Absolute hero. So this guy obviously claps. What's hilarious, though, is that the hot takes that you'll see, especially among the Mythic Plus community, is that these specs, Feral Druid, Survival Hunter, Ret Paladin, to some extent, they suck, but nobody's actually willing to say that you can't do high keys with them. But people in the plus 15s, the people who are like toiling around, not actually putting in a whole lot of effort to push high keys, but are talking about high keys as if they know everything, um, are completely wrong about the power of these specs. Like even Enhancement Shaman, you can push high keys on Enhancement Shaman. You know what I mean? Like you just can. Let's look at the leaderboard real quick for Enhancement Shaman. I guarantee you, there's people in here. I'll just pull it up here. Yeah, so there are people in here who are going to get Tormented Hero, right? Like you can push high keys, and they're 2600, 2700 IO Enhancement Shamans. You telling me you can't push a plus 20 with Enhancement Shaman? Like you can do it, you just have to get better. All right, and then in a range DPS, some outliers here as well. Um, Demonology Warlock is pretty far down in the pits. The Implosion build for Demonology is hilarious. If you guys haven't, like, if you're playing Warlock and you haven't tried the Implosion build for Demonology Warlock, I highly recommend it. It's not the strongest thing in the world, but it is absolutely hilarious to play because you'll like fire a giant imp army into the group and then you have like 50% haste all of a sudden. It is an absolute blast to play. But just not a lot of people are playing it, and generally the strongest Demonology build is the just running Wolfrids, getting the cooldown reduction on your tyrant. But that's not nearly as fun as running the Implosion build. Arcane mages are struggling in terms of played. Their representation is low, but their power is actually quite high. There are a couple of issues with Arcane Mage, though. One is if your tank isn't pulling around your burst windows, your damage is actually going to be pretty garbage. Just because you're wasting it or you're holding on to it for too long. And B, they actually have some pretty significant aggro issues when you get massive arcane barrages off. you're pretty much going to rip aggro from the tank, and that can create some issues with the group. I think the actual probably the weakest spec in Mythic Plus right now for range DPS is Shadow Priest, and I take that with a grain of salt, right? There's still people absolutely dominating with Shadow Priest, right? The problem that I see with Shadow Priest is that it's not fulfilling a specific niche within groups all that well. For people who are actually utilizing Shadow Priest for all of its strengths, you can see there are a lot of people who are succeeding with it. And range DPS in general in Shadowlands Season 2 have had a lot of really good options, right? Because you're not concerned about hunters, you're not concerned about frost mages. And again, this is just representation. I would say probably the strongest range DPS spec in Shadowlands has been Balanced Druid. Not a lot of people are playing it, but when you compare it to other things, but Balanced Druid has been really strong, especially the Venthyr build, right? Um, but Shadow Priest is probably the weakest, again, because it's very difficult to actually utilize the niches, and you have in some certain situations uh, a difficulty in surviving things. But for the most part, saying Shadow Priest is the weakest range DPS spec in Mythic Plus is kind of like saying, you're the weakest runner at the Olympics. You're still your spec is still probably dominating in the greater scheme of things, right? Range DPS has been pretty good in terms of actual performance. I would say Demonology Warlock is probably the worst in range DPS, but Demonology Warlock and Warlock in general has so many specific use cases in Mythic Plus that provide you a lot of value in your group that um, I would never say any Warlock spec is bad. So, but that's pretty much the rundown with the meta, guys. Let me know what you think down in the comments. It's a little bit different of a video, so if you guys don't like it, feel free to let me know. And again, take this all with a grain of salt. I'm talking about the meta as I see it, and also kind of the playability of things. It's not like the be all end all. And if you look at this video and you say, well, he just trashed Feral Druid, I don't think I'll play it anymore. Which I don't think I have that sort of power over anyone's decision making. But if that is what you take from this video, definitely do not do that. Because if you're playing Feral Druid, you can still perform at a high level, especially in season 3. Check out that tier set if you haven't yet. That's looking like a banger. All right, this has been Bowserkins. Checking out the meta, guys. You guys have a good one. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.